The Cuman riders were nearly on top of them now, and they could wait no longer. "For glory!" Richard roared and spurred his horse forward. The Cuman army rushed toward them with a terrible clamor like a great avalanche. The entire horizon seemed to be alive, undulating and rolling toward the Crusaders. Arrows rained down on the knights. Though they were largely ineffective against soldiers who were fully armored, many of Richard's men had been forced to leave behind pieces of their armor as they rushed to meet the surprise attack, leaving them much more exposed to the arrows than they might otherwise have been. Men and horses were collapsing everywhere. Richard, however, had been prepared, and even though he presented a very large and conspicuous target and was, therefore, peppered with arrows as he rode, the missiles merely broke against his heavy armor and fell to the ground, scarcely more than a nuisance. The foremost of the Cumans were only 300 yards away and closing fast. At this distance, Richard could make out their light-colored skin showing from under their traditional conical helmets. Attached to these helmets was a leather aventail that enclosed the rider's neck to protect his throat. Below the aventail, they wore thick padded robes trimmed in various colors to distinguish different ranks. Thick leather covered the robes, and small leather bucklers were strapped to their forearms. Each rider also carried a bow, dagger, and a short sword. Their armor was clearly selected for mobility or for the possibility of facing other riders armed with light missile weapons. "They are about to see," Richard thought, "how grossly inadequate leather is against steel." He raised his lance from where it rested in his stirrup, dropped its point parallel to the ground, and secured the end in the crook of his arm. He was poised to shred the Cumans. He gave a grunt of satisfaction when the line of cavalry followed suit in one smooth motion. At least they got that right. If these knights are half as well trained as they boast, this fight will be over before it begins. Richard braced for impact, but the enemy did not oblige him. At 200 yards out, the fleet-footed Cuman cavalry turned to their right in a tight arc that should have caused horses to stumble over each other, and riders to be thrown from saddles and trampled. The Cumans, however, executed the turn with perfect discipline, and began racing back the way they had come, as easily as if their mounts had been casually strolling miles apart from each other. "They are fleeing!" Count Louis laughed exultantly. "The battle is won before it is even joined." But Richard was not convinced. "Ride them down, men!" he shouted to his own cavalry. "Now, while their backs are to us!" Richard's instincts told him that this was a trap, but he knew that if he and his men could cut down the Cumans before they had a chance to spring it, the day would be theirs regardless. He lowered his head and spurred his horse on even harder. The last of the Cuman riders were just a few yards ahead of him. He could almost reach them. Try as he might, though, Richard's Newmarket steed, bred for its size and strength, could not match the speed of the Cuman mounts. The Cumans opened the gap between Richard and his men to 50 yards, far enough that they were not in any immediate danger, but close enough that Richard felt as though he might catch them. One league passed, then another. Richard looked over his shoulder to see how the foot soldiers were faring, but they were no longer visible. "We are too far out!" Louis shouted at him, echoing the voice of warning that was screaming in his own head. "This is a trap, you fool!" the voice shouted at him. "But they are so close," Richard argued. "I can almost catch them. Just one more push." His horse was heavily lathered, and he knew he could not keep up this pace much longer, but he forced the animal on even faster. He could feel the powerful muscles of his huge destrier bunch and stretch beneath him as his great hooves churned the earth. "At last," he thought, "they are mine." But just as he felt that he was finally closing the distance to the Cuman rearguard, they hunched down in their saddles, and the distance between them and the chivalry opened even wider. "Sir Richard!" Louis shouted again. "We must call this off. We cannot push these horses any harder." "The marshlands are just ahead," Richard called back. "They will have to slow down, and we will catch them there." As he yelled, the last of the Cuman forces disappeared around a stone outcropping. Richard led his men around the rock face and slowed in surprise. They were in a small canyon lined on the right side by the rock formation that jutted 10 feet in the air and ran back hundreds of yards to where it intersected with a thick tangle of undergrowth that marked the border of the swamp and hemmed them in on the left. On a patch of ground just in front of this intersection, the Cumans were fanning out into a defensive line. It was not the line that caught Richard's attention, however. It was the rearmost riders that were waiting to take their positions. These men had thinned down from riding 20 or more abreast to riding only 2 by 2. And what was even more odd was that they were not joining ranks from the logical place in the center of the formation, but were moving diagonally to the far end of the line out near the swamp. "What is happening?" Richard called to Louis. "Why?" A scream on his right, followed by 2 more from his left, gave him the answer he sought. Riders in full gallop were swinging around the stone outcropping and plunging into knee-deep muck. "The ground is soft!" someone exclaimed as riders crashed down all around. "We are already in the swamp!" Richard shouted needlessly to Louis. "The Cumans must have prepared a way through." "Follow me," he ordered. 2 by 2. Richard did not wait for Louis's protests. Instead, he set a course diagonally across the field toward the end of the Cuman line where he had seen the last of the enemy take position. His men were still being thrown from their saddles as the firm ground unexpectedly gave way to deep, sticky mud. But slowly the word was spreading down the line, and they began to fall into formation behind Richard. The line of knights stretched out behind Richard and Louis as they felt their way along the path toward the enemy. The slow-moving line presented an easy target for the Cuman bowmen. "This is madness!" Louis screamed at Richard. "We must pull back!" Richard knew that he was right, of course, but the trap had already been sprung. "What would you have us do?" he demanded of Louis. "If we attempt to turn the entire line, they will cut us down having never faced a blade. Do you not think that this was their intention all along? They cannot be more than 500 of them. If we press through, they will have nowhere to run." The knights moved on, feeling their way across the marsh amidst the barrage of arrows. The relatively close range coupled with the slow-moving targets made this arrow storm decidedly more deadly than the first. "Sir Richard!" Louis shouted. He halted to help one of his knights, whose horse had stumbled from an arrow that grazed its knee. Richard ignored him. He was too close to be turned now, even if his entire army should fall. His frustration at their impotence against a force they should have easily decimated was boiling into blind rage. At last he again reached solid ground. The Cuman line stood only 50 yards ahead of him, with their backs nearly to the rock wall. "Fools!" Richard thought. "It was a clever trap, but you leave yourself nowhere to flee, and flee you will, for there is nothing between you and me but brush-covered earth." A rough line of knights formed to each side of him, and the Crusaders once more trained their lances on the Cumans. "Destroy them!" Richard roared, and drove his heavily lathered mount into a gallop once more. The knights followed suit. They charged ahead, heedless of the piles of brush that were scattered everywhere. It was only as Richard approached one of these brush patches that something caught his eye. It looked to be nothing more than a shadow in the lower corner beneath the weeds, but there was something about it that did not look quite right. Suddenly, his horse leapt into the air, scarcely clearing what he now recognized as another Cuman trap. The knight behind him was not so lucky, and both rider and mount disappeared into the pit. Richard heard screams and the sharp crack of timber snapping as the sharpened stakes at the bottom of the pits pierced man and horse alike. He bellowed a curse as all around him horses and riders began disappearing. The air filled with the cries of men and beasts as the remaining knights plunged into the camouflaged holes that dotted the area between the swamp and the Cumans. "I have lost most of my cavalry from 500 Cumans! Stupid fool!" he cursed himself. His teeth ground as he and his 50 remaining men came through this latest series of traps. Though the Cumans now outnumbered the Crusaders, he knew the Cumans and their flimsy armor didn't stand a chance against the knight's superior training and equipment. He gripped his lance tighter. "I will single-handedly tear these foreign devils limb from limb." Richard scoffed as the Cumans shouldered their bows, drew their daggers and swords, and charged the small pack of knights. He did not break stride as his lance took the first of the attackers in the chest, easily piercing his leather cuirass and skewering him completely through. The lance drove so far through the man that Richard was unable to free it before their horses passed each other. The force of the charge and the weight of the man's body snapped the weapon in half. While not fully unexpected, lances routinely broke in battle, Richard was dismayed that it had broken so early. He barely had time to think about the lance, though, before another Cuman struck at him. Richard deflected the man's thrust, then crushed his skull with the stub of the lance, before tossing it aside and drawing his greatsword. Though greatly outnumbered, The few remaining knights and those who were slowly trickling in after extricating themselves from the swamps began to push the Cuman force back. 100 Cuman soldiers were emptied at the first clash while their swords bounced harmlessly off the knights' armor. The knights were angry and cut through the ill-prepared Cumans as though they were nothing but stalks of wheat. Richard in particular displayed his fury as he routinely severed limbs and decapitated his unfortunate individual opponents. He was determined to exact payment for every moment of humiliation he had suffered from these cowards' fiendish games. Had they faced me like men, he thought, I may have considered granting them some quarter, but now I will cut every last one of them into dog meat. Richard dealt death at every blow, pushing further and further into the enemy ranks. The mass of bodies he left in his wake inspired terror in all who thought to withstand him. Soon he was swinging at retreating backs as the Cuman soldiers realized it was certain death to face this demon warrior, whose crimson armor ran thick with the blood of all who ventured too close. Long hair whipping out from under his bone mask, he seemed to have ridden straight from the pits of hell on the back of his massive black destrier. Richard swung his claymore to retreating back, but only cut the air in front of him. He looked around at the panic he was causing, smiled, and threw his arms wide as he roared at the heavens. His exultation was shortly interrupted, however, by a commotion behind him. He turned just in time to see Count Louis, who had almost made it up to him, disappear into a crowd of enemies. Cuman infantry were streaming from out of the undergrowth, where they had apparently been lying in wait for this moment. Each man was armed with a long spear tipped with a large metal hook. Several of the men had slid their hooks around Louis's neck and pulled him from his saddle. He hit the ground hard, stunned and vulnerable. The Count scarcely offered any resistance as several men fell on him, furiously hacking at every inch of exposed flesh. Richard moved in to help, but was slowed considerably by the infantry trying to snare him with the same hooks. Cuman soldiers were suddenly everywhere. Some of them dragged knights from their saddles, while others beat the knights senseless once they were down. Richard dodged a hook, cut another in half, and then grabbed a third and slammed it into its wielder's face. His mount kicked out behind, and 2 more enemies fell. Despite the carnage he was dealing, the infantrymen and their hooks continued to harass him. Richard drew back to cut into the group that still surrounded Louis, but a hook caught his elbow. He roared in frustration and swung with all his might. The man holding the pole was yanked forward and stumbled to the ground in front of Richard's horse. The huge animal reared up and continued Richard's work of death. Within minutes, Richard had killed or scattered those who surrounded Louis. Yet, as fast as he was not surprised to find the Count lying motionless. His helmet and armor had been stripped from him, and blood flowed freely from gashes all over his body. Richard cursed. He cared nothing for Louis, of course, but the indignity of the day was too much. "Lord Richard!" Richard looked up to see a knight pointing back over the rocks. In the distance, a black plume of smoke rose into the sky. Richard stared in consternation. He wanted to believe that somehow Adrianople was burning, that perhaps the infantry he had abandoned in this reckless pursuit had turned and ransacked the city. But the column of smoke was too far east to be coming from the city. Richard knew it could only be his camp that was burning, and his camp could only be burning if his army was utterly defeated. He hung his head. This entire scheme had been part of a coordinated effort by Emperor Kaloyan to lead the chivalry away while the rest of the Bulgarian army decimated the infantry. Richard swore at himself. I should have seen this from the moment the Cumans refused to engage me in battle. But instead I fell into their trap like some idiot conscript. He glanced over the remnants of his line to see how the others were faring, and was startled by the number of empty saddles. He was almost alone in the midst of hundreds of enemy soldiers. He cursed himself again. He could not have acted his part more perfectly if he had been in the Emperor's employ. All that I have worked for, the honor, the prestige, and the glory earned over years of campaigning, is for naught because of this one misjudgment that was sure to end in an ignominious rout. So this, Richard thought, is the despair of defeat. For the first time since he reached maturity, Richard experienced what his opponents had always felt at his hand. Strangely, though, he felt no fear at the prospect of his army's complete annihilation. There was only a knot in his stomach born of the humiliation and disgrace that accompanied failure. Richard turned. 50 yards behind him, the battered survivors of the Cuman traps were being pushed back as they struggled to reform their line. His men were no longer fighting to win, but to survive. He continued to berate himself for not being more aware of the battle at large. He had become so accustomed to always being victorious, to always routing the enemy, that he had neglected to properly lead his men. He had fallen into the habit of merely being a gallant banner for them to follow, while he concentrated on exterminating the enemy. When his men fell or fled, it was no longer a question of if. He would be left alone in a sea of enemy soldiers. So be it, Richard thought. If this is to be my legacy, then I will walk from the field, leaving legions of dead in my wake. As Richard's resolve hardened, the crowd around him became aware of just how outnumbered he was. Time stood still as each of the players realized their separate positions. Nobody moved. Then, like a thunderclap, the moment broke as Richard roared, wheeled his mount, and cleaved into the Cuman army, determined to cut his way to freedom. The Cumans, who had been giving Richard a wide berth a moment before, now found courage to face him. They knew well who he was. They knew it was he who had led this campaign, he who had butchered any and all people as he saw fit, and he who would bring untold misery and sorrow upon them for taking part in this battle, if he were allowed to escape. But they had him trapped, and they would see to it that he never had the chance to exact revenge for what they had just done to his army. The Cumans rushed in to attack. Richard's warhorse reared back and crushed the first two hapless soldiers that reached him. Balancing expertly in his saddle, Richard slashed furiously in every direction, his 4-foot blade hewing down all those within reach. Nevertheless, they continued to come. Each time one would fall, 2 more would take his place. Richard continued to swing savagely as the press of enemies grew tighter around him. He hacked at the head of one man only to find the point of his giant blade being hindered by the body of the soldier behind. He gritted his teeth and slashed ever harder, but even the mighty Richard Dawning could not cut through them all. Even as Richard's effectiveness was being hampered, 100 blades and spears struck at him from the crowd. They stabbed at his horse, they grabbed at his arms and legs, anything they could find. Suddenly his massive destrier emitted a terrible neighing sound, and its hind legs buckled. Richard stumbled backwards out of his saddle, but managed to retain his footing as his hamstrung animal collapsed before him. Though this was the perfect opportunity to finish him off, the soldiers were still terribly afraid of this enormous, inhuman figure that somehow seemed even more intimidating on the ground than he had on horseback. Facing him this close, it was impossible for the Cuman soldiers to overlook how much bigger than them he was. His helmet's bone face, caked as it was in the blood of their comrades, showed no pain, no fear, no fatigue, only unyielding cruelty. One soldier took courage and charged Richard's rear flank, determined to find a chink in the wicked armor. He almost made it. Richard regained his balance in time to spin and deflect the spear, but the soldier was unable to stop, and his momentum carried him into Richard's chest. The footman cried out as he saw what was happening, not realizing that it was his very proximity to Richard that was preventing the knight from dispatching him. He slammed into Richard's chest, his head bouncing off something sharp in the middle of Richard's breastplate. He blinked the pain away long enough to see the Dawning family crest, set in the center of the huge chestplate, fall from its setting and tumble to the ground. He was still staring at it when Richard, who had merely grunted at the impact, slid his sword arm under the soldier's shoulder, pivoted, and hurled him into the sea of befuddled Cuman soldiers. Screaming and flailing, the man flew 10 feet and landed across 4 men. The group collapsed in a tangled heap. Through the break in the men, Richard spotted his chance to escape. Only 40 yards back the way he had come, the point where the swampy undergrowth butted into the rock face might enable him to use the undergrowth to propel himself to the top of the rocks. From there he could easily defend himself as the Cumans attempted to climb up after him, or perhaps even spot a remnant of his army with which to make an escape. He turned and once more began his march to freedom. But now it was not only the press of soldiers that was impeding his escape. He felt his blade losing its edge, doling itself on the bones of his victims. Nevertheless, he fought on. He made it 20 yards, and then 30. A trail of dead and broken bodies lay strewn in his wake. It began to look as though he was going to reach his escape. The Cumans could see that they were no match for Richard's strength, and no one was willing to face him alone. Nevertheless, the army as a whole possessed a will that superseded that of the individual, and they continued surging toward him. Each time the Cuman forces surged forward, Richard easily dispatched another luckless victim. Because the soldiers were so afraid of him, and because they were bunched so tightly together, they were unable to execute a coordinated attack, which might have given them a chance. Instead, the men at the forefront of the battle would attempt to escape into the group behind them, only to be shoved off balance into Richard's path and deprived of any opportunity to time an attack. Among those in the inner circle was a young man who, before today, had yet to see a real battle. He had been involved in skirmishes but had never faced the might of the armored knights. The youth trembled before the demon that he feared had risen straight from hell to destroy him. His eyes widened as he saw Richard slaughtering other soldiers only a few feet from where he stood. The young man was suddenly acutely aware that his small, stocky frame, insufficiently protected as it was by an oversized helmet and iron-lined cuirass, was nothing against the Goliath before him. His courage failed him, and he turned back to find safety in the crowd. Instead of disappearing into the army, however, he was rebuffed by the wall of his own men and thrown back directly into the path of the monster. He felt warm urine running down his trembling leg as he braced himself to fight. His arm was weak as he slowly raised his sword, hoping against hope that Richard would not turn on him. But Richard did turn on him, and for a moment the young man stared into dark eyes that lurked behind the evil, blood-drenched bone mask. His hand went limp and his sword clattered to the ground. Richard saw the unarmed youth shaking before him. He smelled the urine, but rather than pity, disdain was the only emotion he felt. He lost no time bringing his sword down with a great overhead slice. It was a mighty blow that may have cleaved the boy's torso cleanly in two had it not been for his banded cuirass. The thin metal strips did not cut cleanly, but bent and curled around Richard's blade, lodging it midway through the boy. Richard tried to pull his sword out, but it didn't move. Furiously, he thrashed, whipping the boy's body around like a rag doll, trying to free his weapon. A quick-thinking Cuman, realizing that Richard's sword was stuck and that all his attention was focused on freeing it, saw his chance. The Cuman, summoning his courage and squeezing his eyes shut, raised his cudgel and leapt forward, swinging wildly in front of him. His blind swing missed Richard's head, but fell on the back of Richard's gauntleted hand and broke his grip from the hilt of his sword. At this, another soldier took courage. Raising his sword in both hands, he swung ferociously at the now disarmed knight. Richard lunged at this new attacker, knocking his sword to the side and tackling him to the ground. The two men rolled in a fierce grappling match, Richard trying to get control of the Cuman and the Cuman struggling desperately to get free of Richard. Other soldiers quickly stepped up to help, but they could not safely distinguish the knight from their fellow infantrymen, rolling on the ground as they were. Dropping his weapon, a second man leapt in to assist his comrade, just as Richard rolled on top of the Cuman with whom he was struggling. The newcomer threw his whole body against Richard's and held tight to Richard's huge right arm as the knight drew back to strike the first man. Richard threw the clinging man back into the crowd and then smashed the face of the soldier who was beneath him, breaking his nose and teeth. By this time, more soldiers were gaining confidence and joining the fray. Some leapt onto his arms, legs, and body, while others hit, kicked, and tried to wrestle him to his back, where his heavy plate armor would put him at a serious disadvantage. Richard, however, was not going down without a fight. He hurled another Cuman away from him, and in so doing swept two more off of him. He tried to push himself to his feet, but was bowled over by a fresh group of soldiers even bigger than the last. He stumbled and fell under the weight of so many men. They spread out around his prone body, and with 3 and 4 men to an appendage, held him to the ground. A burly soldier crouched next to Richard's head and drew a dagger. He slid the long, thin blade down near Richard's throat. Richard twisted to get away and pulled against those restraining him, but they held on for all they were worth. The soldier slipped the blade under Richard's chin and cut the straps that held his bone helmet in place, then roughly jerked the helmet free. A momentary silence fell over the assembled soldiers. Though they had known Richard was nothing but a man, It was difficult to relegate the invincible monster that had cut down scores of their men only moments before to the ordinary human face before them now. It was as if pulling off his helmet had broken a spell that turned the devil back into a man. A heavy-set Cuman with a thin mustache pushed his way up to Richard. Those soldiers securing Richard made room for him, though they did not relinquish their hold on the huge knight. The newcomer stood over Richard and glared down at him. Richard returned the look with his own hate-filled stare. The Cuman did not speak, but his lips quivered with rage-filled excitement. Richard Dawning was completely at his mercy. After a moment, he spat on Richard and raised the point of his blade to drive it through the hated knight's face. "Stop!" a harsh voice barked over the heads of those surrounding Richard. The crowd parted to permit a giant of a man to approach the captive. He was huge, taller even than Richard himself, though not as massively built. Stringy black hair partially covered a scar that ran down the left side of his face, and his skin was much lighter than his comrades'. The collar and cuffs of his robe were trimmed in silver, marking him as a person of consequence. "An honorable death is far too good for this animal." Richard's anger was momentarily replaced by shock. "You? What are you doing here?" The giant looked down at him, a sneer pulling the scar on his cheek. "My people are everywhere," he said, and then barked orders to bind the prisoner. The soldiers hastened to obey, making sure to keep Richard well in check at every moment. Several men stood over him with their weapons poised to strike. The slightest bit of resistance earned him a sharp rap on his now exposed head. "This is your doing?" The giant shrugged. "The Emperor is not an overly clever man. Someone had to step in to ensure that he did not squander his advantage." The giant then turned to the men around him. "Secure him to a horse. He is coming with me. Secure him well. We have a long way to go." The mustached Cuman who had been about to dispatch Richard looked as though he would object, but when the giant turned his cold eyes on him, he quickly wilted and rushed to obey. The Cumans dragged their prisoner to a horse and threw him over its back. The last thing Richard saw before they slipped a black cowl over his head was the Cuman stabbing his suffering horse on a field littered with dead, and the black plume of smoke from his raised camp rising in the distance.